We're going to work through the text tonight from Psalm 90. So you can turn in your bulletin to Psalm 90 if you would, as I get myself ready here. RJ, where are you at? All right, I'm going to pass this down. You can be our man with the Bible if I have any. You've got yours there too, okay. If I have any passages for you to look up, I'll do that. Psalm 90, I've always been interested in this psalm, and I've been interested for several reasons. Number one, it's a hard nut to crack. Number two, it has an unusual title. If you look there at Psalm 90, what do you see? I put it in there so that you could see it, but when you go to your Bibles, or if you had your Bible, you're going to see this title there. It has a very unusual title. What title is there? You can look at it. Let's all read it there together. A prayer of Moses, the man of God. How many other psalms do we have from Moses in the Psalter? We know Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and he did compose various songs, or psalms, you might say, in that book. How many psalms in the Psalter are attributed to Moses? One, no other ones, just this one. So it's very unique. So hard nut to crack. It's unusual in that it's a psalm of Moses. Who was the greatest prophet of the Old Testament? Moses was. So at the close of the year, we want to hear what he says because he addresses us on a very important topic, and that is the topic of death. The other reason I'm interested in it is because, very interestingly enough, I still to this day don't know the reason why, but my previous congregation had a cornerstone, and on that cornerstone was the name of the congregation in German and also the date that that congregation was built and formed. And underneath it, you might say the verse that that congregation was founded on was Psalm 90, verse 17. The very last verse of this psalm was the very, you might say, cornerstone of that congregation. That's what that congregation in Wisconsin wanted their people to cling to. Now, the fourth and final reason its themes are appropriate for tonight as we end this year and as we begin another year. And it's appropriate also for one other reason. In one of my previous congregations that I grew up at, I was talking to the kids about this today. We at that congregation every New Year's Eve had what's called in German a Totenfest. How many of you have ever heard of the term Totenfest before? Probably not, but you probably know what it is. We do it once a year here in this congregation, but our congregation history is to do it on All Saints' Day. It's where we name the names of all the people in the congregation who died in the past year, and what do? We ring the bell for them. So in the congregation that I grew up in, one of the congregations that I grew up in, every New Year's Eve, we would actually come, and what would we do? We would recount all the individuals who had died in the past year, and we rang the bell. So it was a day, and it has a long-standing custom. Our opening hymn stanza 4 mentioned kind of that theme of death. It's fitting for that reason as well. We're thinking about the passing of time. We're thinking about those who died this past year. And also some of us here are wondering what? What about the next year, right? Will I be here what? Next year. Will this be? I had some shut-in visits this week, and they're hoping that 2023 for them is the year their number gets pulled, okay? Right. So it's appropriate because it's about death. Now, why would Moses talk about death? He talked about death. Now, we want to talk about Moses for a bit in the context for this psalm, but one of the first questions I want to ask you is this. What was Moses' job? What job did God give Moses to do? Raise your hand so I can see you talk, but what was Moses' basic job description? Please. He was a shepherd, and after he was a shepherd of sheep, he was a shepherd of what? Of people. Yeah, and what? And he was going to deliver the people from what? From slavery in what country? And bring them to the promised land. Bring them to the promise. That was his job. Moses was probably thinking this would take a short amount of time, but it took a lot longer than actually it set out to take. Ultimately, what was the plan? They would get to Mount Sinai, they would get the directions, God would go with his people, they would go to the border of Canaan, and what would they do? They would begin the conquest of Canaan almost immediately. Instead, what happened? They sent out the 12 spies, and of the 12 spies, 10 of them came back with what? Instead of trusting in the Lord's word, and instead of saying, the Lord will deliver us, instead of saying what? God will help us through. He's given us a promise. What did they do? The people who live there are too large. There's no way that we can fight against them. Yes, the land is wonderful, but we'll lose if we go in. And what was the punishment that God gave his people because of that? You can read this later on if you've got time tonight, if you can't sleep. Numbers 14, this chapter here is really what God said. Now, I'm going to read a little bit of this before we get in because it gives you some context here, but I want you to think about the punishment. But before we get to the punishment as we listed, what was the punishment for them disbelieving? I mean, Caleb and Joshua came back with a good report. What was the punishment? 40 years what? Traveling in the wilderness until what took place? Until all that, say that word again, the G word. The whole generation what? Died. What ages? Anyone? 20 years old and older. Once they died, then that next generation would what? And God said ultimately that all of their corpses would be scattered where? In the wilderness. Are we wondering why Moses focuses on death? Because what was his job? He had a new job description. Wait till everyone what? Dies, and then you can go in, right? Wait till everyone dies. So he's waiting for this generation. As they're going through the wilderness, they're waiting for this generation to die so that they can ultimately take up the promise again and enter into the promised land. But Moses isn't just thinking about death for God's people. He's also thinking about his own mortality. Why is Moses also thinking? There's maybe two answers to this question. Why is Moses thinking about his own mortality? First of all, how old is Moses at about this time? He's pretty old. Anytime I ask one of the old timers in the congregation to serve on the board of elders and they say I'm too old, I like to remind them that Moses started deliverance of God's people at 80 years of age, right? 80 was when he what? Began his service, and God gave him another 40 years. So he was quite old himself. But why also was Moses thinking about death as well, and death also as punishment? We want to think about that because really that's a theme of the psalm. Death as punishment, the punishment of God. What did Moses fail to do? Please, Nathan.
He failed to. He struck the rock.
He struck the rock instead of what? He got frustrated with God's people and he misrepresented God. Instead of showing and displaying God's character as a loving God who would forgive their sins, he struck the rock when God said, speak of it. And he said, what did he say to God's people? Instead of saying, God will take care of you even though you're a bunch of sinners, he said what? Here is the water, you rebels, right? And then God said, because you misrepresented me before God's people, you did not keep my name holy, you will not be able to do what? Nathan? You can't go into the promised land. So not only was Was Moses thinking about what? The death of the people. You might say he was a shepherd of death. He was thinking also about his own failure and his own mortality. That is the picture we want to paint before we jump and dive into this psalm. There's a lot that could be said about this psalm. We can't unpack every verse, but we want to ask you a few questions. Okay? First question. I got 5 questions. The first question is I want you to look through verses 1 through 6, and I'll probably just read them, and I want you to see how is God spoken of and how are the people spoken of. You're going to see a contrast here. I want you to notice that contrast because it's very important. I'm going to read verses 1 through 6. How is God spoken of and how are people spoken of? Verse 1, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. First question, reading through verses 1 through 6, there's a contrast here. It's the most important thing in these first 6 verses. We see a contrast. How's God spoken of? How are people spoken of? What do we see here as we look at man, as we look at God? RJ, please. God is eternal. He's always been there, and he always will be there. Man is just a flash in the pan. What analogies does he use here? What pictures does he use? Grass, like grass, right? In the morning, it's strong, and this is like the generations, right? He's also talking about the generations. The generations grow up, right? Just this 2 weeks ago, buried my father. He's got one more sibling. Out of 4, and after that generation is totally what? Gone. And then comes what? The next generation, right? So like grass growing up, strong at the beginning, and then it withers and falls away, as if it's just a day. What other analogies are used here of mankind and the fleetingness or the transitoriness of man? Any other analogies that we see here? Dust, like a dream. Say it again. A what? Did you say watch? A night watch. How did the ancients, Michael, divide the night? Into watches. How many were there? It depended whether you're a Greek or a Roman or a Jew, but 3 to 5 watches of the night. Yeah, so not even a full night. Our lives are considered like what? Just a watch in the night, a short period of the night. You know, a lot of times we think our lives are very long, but once they come to an end, they feel very what? Brief. There's times in which we think, Lord, speed things up, but when the Lord finally comes and shows himself, we say, slow things down, right? When my father had the heart attack and I went to visit him at the bedside, I was expecting to find a father who was comatose. We would remove the tubes because there wasn't life left, and it would be a very easy decision. Instead, I went there, and what did I find? A man who had lived 78 years, and he wanted to get in the deer blind one more time. He didn't want to what? He didn't want to die. Can we put the tubes back in if we have to take them out? Yes, he's ready. He wants to live what? He wants to live longer. When we see death at the door there, all of a sudden we say, Lord, give me a little bit more time, right? Okay, so man is pictured as his life being very fleeting. God is everlasting there before the mountains were made. Question number 2. According to verses 7 through 8, and we're going to also look at verse 3, what is death and who is responsible for death? Moses gives us a different picture of death than most people have. I'm going to read those verses, but this is the question. According to verses 7 through 8 and verse 3, what is death and who is responsible for death? All right. For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. Jump back to 3. You return man to dust and say, return, O children of man. According to these verses, what is death, and ultimately, who is responsible for death? What do we see in this passage that death is? Maybe you're not really getting what I'm asking.
Consequence for sin.
Consequence for sin. The wages of sin is what? In the day that you eat it, you will surely what? As my dad was laying there on the bed, one of the things I said to him is, you got to carry a cross right now. And it's the wages of sin. And it's not easy to carry that cross. Right? You are experiencing, Dad, right now what? Sin. And a life of sin. And that's not an easy cross to bear. We are called, according to Moses, to look at death specifically. Luther will say in his commentary that animals merely die as a part of this life, the natural course of God's order, because of sin and frustration in this world, but animals don't die because of wrath. Animals don't die because of God's anger. But ultimately, we are to see, that as we die and as we experience death, it is because we are experiencing God's wrath and also his anger. Another question. As God's wrath afflict us, is this a sign of God's hatred of us or of his loving chastening? Okay? Right? If we are his people, it is his chastening. And so when I experience the throes of death, I also must see that this is what God wills for me. I'm not experiencing this as one who is hated by my Father in heaven, but one who is dearly loved because he wants me to experience this. So I put no trust in what? Myself. In the end, I'm a corpse, and I experience his wrath and anger. And it's why my father prayed like he never prayed at death, because there was only one thing he had. What doctor was going to help him? What medicine was going to help him? Who was going to help him? No one on earth. And it's at that moment you realize, I've only got one life left. Right? So the very God who chastens me is the very God who loves me. It's a very important point when you are experiencing the wrath of God. And all of you at times in your life this year experience it. You say, I'm not a Christian. You say, I'm too much of a sinner. You say, I don't believe enough. You experience at that moment the wrath and the fullness of God. The wrong response of this to say is, God is showing me these things because he hates me. Or God is showing or revealing these things because he's showing me that I am not his. Instead, we are to see that God shows me this wrath and God shows me this anger that he might what? Draw me closer to him, that I am his beloved child. I likened it to my father when he spanked me. One arm was for the spanking, one arm was for the hug after it was over. He had to spank me before he what? He could draw me close. And so too, the sign of the spanking is not the sign of God's hatred, but of his dearest love. When we experience God's wrath, he desires not for us to flee and run away, but he indeed desires to draw us near. Third question, according to verses 9 through 10, what is life and old age pictured like? According to verses 9 and 10, okay, it's the golden years, right? Let's look at it. 9 and 10, for all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh, can be translated like a noise or a sound. A sound goes out and then the sound stops. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80. Yet their span, or can be translated pride, all the things we trust in, fame, scholarship, beauty, wealth, a life of ease. Yet their pride is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone and we fly away. How does the Scriptures describe our life at the end? What's it like? For our shut-ins, that some of them are confined to a wheelchair or bed. We get to those ages in life we can't do what we used to do. Our brains don't work right. Our bodies don't work right. Okay? We're suffering. We're suffering the effects of God's wrath. Wrath he wants us to experience because he loves us. We'll go on. This is the clincher. Verse 11, what is the answer to this question? I find this to be the clincher of this psalm. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you. This is the clincher. The answer to this is what? You want to do this? No. All right. Then don't laugh at me. You'll get your turn someday after you go to seminary. Then I can sit in the pew and laugh at you. All right. What is Moses saying here? Who considers this? None of us consider it rightly. The answer is we take all of this for what? For granted. We don't recognize that these things that we suffer are because of God's anger and because of his wrath, and we don't take our days seriously. That is the clincher. What's the title of the psalm? Say it. How much prayer have we gotten to yet? None. Except for what? Now. The rest is the prayer. After Moses lays the foundation, as we get to this point saying, Lord, we don't take our days seriously. We don't take your anger seriously. We don't do these things as we ought. We don't amend our ways or take things seriously. Now Moses moves to prayer. And all of the rest of the psalm has to do with God's prayers. I'm going to read it, and I want you to think about what we're praying for. But I really want you to think about this. How do we begin the new year? How does Moses teach us to end the old year and begin the new year? On our what? On our knees, praying for these particular things. Let's read it. Read it with me, verse 12. It's a prayer. It's the prayer of Moses. Let's make it our prayer as well. So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Go back to verse 12, and I want you to just meditate. We'll spend 3 minutes or so here. In conclusion, what are the prayers? What are we praying for? Number 12, verse 12, what are we praying for? Lord, what? Help me to see. Help me to number my days. Help me to see the transitoriness, the fleetingness of life, the brevity of life, that I might gain a heart of wisdom. And this is wisdom that ultimately leads to salvation, that I might not put my trust in myself, but only in Jesus. How about 13? Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. What's another word for pity? Show what? We say it all the time. Lord, have what? Mercy. In the next verse, satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, your covenant faithfulness. What are we praying for here? We're praying for mercy and for God to show us His what? Steadfast love. Let me explain this. Mercy is that we don't get what we do deserve. Okay? What do we want to see according to verse 14? Show us your what? Your love. In the midst of wrath, we want God to show us what? What do we want Him to show us this year? That He indeed does in His Son very much what? Love us. We want to see God's love, and He shows it to us in the cross. And it's in that love. How does that verse start? How are we satisfied in this life? With all the stuff that we fill our lives with? The only thing that satisfies is ultimately to know that God what? Loves us despite also our frailty. And it is ultimately this love that leads us to what? Rejoice and be what? We can be glad and rejoice when we see the cross and when we see God's love. Verse 15, that God would give us days of gladness despite the afflictions we have endured. As many years as we have seen evil, that there might be joy in this life that comes from His gospel. Verse 16, let your work. What is God's work? The work of the cross? Yes? The work of the gospel? The work of preaching? We want to know God's what? Work. And we want it shown to our servants, us, His servants, and His glorious power, what? What do we want for our congregation? What do I want for my family? What do I want for all the children here? I want them both to know two things. What this psalm is about, two things. God's wrath on sin and also His what? Abundant love in Jesus. That's what we want as a congregation as we begin the new year. Also, let your work be shown. Let it be seen. Let us see it. So often our eyes are closed to what God is what? Doing and what He has done. Lord, reveal it. And then finally, verse 17 says, let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us. Favor means grace. Let God's grace be on us. Establish the work of our hands and establish the work of our hands. That's why my previous congregation had that as the cornerstone, because what they were saying, as we preach, as we teach, as we deliver the sacraments, as we have Sunday school, may your works, may our hands be established. May that work of the gospel continue in people's lives, because it is the one thing ultimately that is needful. Anything else you want to say on this psalm or the final prayers? Any more additions you want to make to this right here? Anything else? All right. We'll continue then with the confession of sins. We ask you to stand.